thinking a lot about I think I'm someone who tends to think about identities a lot, and I think it's based off of my undergraduate studies in psychology and Asian American studies, and so there's a certain level of empowerment and feeling of empowerment that I experience by being able to name and claim something. But it's also a evolving path and process. So a really wonderful example, actually, related to a lot of work that I've been recently doing. I identify as a Southeast Asian American woman, specifically as ethnic Vietnamese American. And if you asked me 7 or 8 years ago, I would probably just say Asian American, maybe Chinese American. If you asked me 14 years ago, when I first started high school, I would say, I don't really know, and I don't really know what you mean by that question. And for me, it's been an evolving process because I think as I learn more about my own story, my own family's history, the way that my experience connects to this larger level of global policies, of global history. It's like being able to name an identity helps me continue to do my work better, because claiming an identity isn't just saying that I'm here and I exist, but it also means I'm connected to another group of people. 5 years from now, I'm probably going to identify something very differently, but currently, because I identify very strongly as a Southeast Asian American woman, I've really been diving into memoirs and books and curious about my own family's history, and feeling really ready to speak up and share this experience and story, because it's oftentimes ignored or missing. Or folks are just like, wow, really? That happens? And I'm like, yeah, it happens. The wars in Southeast Asia happened, and there's a reason why there are over 1 million displaced people from that war, and that's not part of the US history that we learn. And it's a war that we got into, and we only kind of ever think of it as, oh, it's the war that no one really wanted, but still, there's still generations of people who are experiencing the aftermath of that conflict. My family, my community, my extended family being one of those. So for me, it's important to be able to name that and to be able to share my experience as a way of educating others, because we're not able to get it through our formal education system. Both my parents were born and raised in South Vietnam, in what is now known as Ho Chi Minh City, but they've always called it Saigon, which is its former name. And as teens, they left Saigon, left Vietnam as refugees because of the Vietnam War. But before that, my grandparents, I think, and so this is part of the history and part of the development process, is how much we know and how much these stories are shared through the generations. My grandparents, both sides, maternal and paternal, born and raised most of their young adult lives in China. They resettled in South Vietnam for business opportunities, for better education for their children, but also because there's a lot of persecution in what was then communist China. And so in some ways, my family's history is grandparents were displaced once from China to Vietnam, and then my parents were displaced a second time from Vietnam to the States. What I know is really, what I know about my family's history all started because of a homework assignment in high school. I was taking an Asian American studies class that had me interview an immigrant. And I was like, well, both my parents are immigrants. This is going to be an easy assignment. And it was the first time that my mom talked about her childhood growing up in Vietnam, her remembering both like the things you remember about childhood, right? The friends you had, the food you ate, the neighborhood you lived in, but also how common it was for her to hear bombs going off in the distance. And at somewhere in her high school years, like 15, 16-ish, her and her family had to flee, had to leave. After, what I've also learned, after Saigon fell, so after South Vietnam, it was very clear that they were losing the war. The ethnic Chinese Vietnamese were always seen as being well-to-do, were always seen as not connected to the larger Vietnamese community. So as soon as the capital fell and the US pulled out, there was actually a lot of persecution of ethnic Chinese Vietnamese too, that they could either leave on their own accord or they would be escorted out or encouraged to leave. So the story you hear about Southeast Asian refugees being on boats for days, like my mom was one of those. Like in her teens, she was on a boat with maybe, I don't know, 20, 25 other people, either she knew or didn't know. She was at sea for 7 days. They'd run out of food, run out of water, not knowing whether or not she was going to see land again before she was finally able to be rescued by well, I guess she was accepted into a refugee camp in Malaysia. My dad's family has a very similar story in that they left a little earlier before Saigon fell, so there wasn't quite as much commotion, but they were also on a boat. They were rescued by the Taiwanese Navy, so it was my grandmother and her 8 children. My grandmother never learned how to read or write or drive a car or anything, but she and her 8 children and whatever money she had left, which as a concept is so, like, inspirational is one thing, but just like, it just reminds me of the privilege that we have, that I have, that it's unlikely that I'm ever going to be displaced. It's unlikely I'm ever going to have to pick up and just go without planning, without knowing if I'm ever going to come back. So neither of my parents have ever actually been back to Vietnam. My dad arrived in '75, my mom arrived in '79 in the States, and both settled in Chicago, which is one of the metropolitan cities that was accepting refugees and resettling refugees at the time. So that's on the north side of Chicago, and that's where I grew up, where I went to school, where none of our family lives there anymore, but my parents still live about 2 miles away from there. So we still go to get groceries, we still go there to eat, but it was in some ways their new home, and it was the first time they'd ever seen snow, and they're still there, but they haven't been back to Vietnam since.